The following podcast contains mature themes and is intended for an adult audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to another episode of Summa Made Simple. In this episode, we begin a series of articles around the topic of virginity. Now, you could be thinking to yourself, okay, maybe virginity is not that relevant a topic to the average common man on the streets today, right? What is its relevant? What is its use? And what I found incredibly useful in these articles on virginity, at least the first two which we're going to cover in this episode, was the main idea was a clarification of what the mean of virtue actually looks like. You know, we like saying virtue lies in the mean. It's a middle ground between two extremes, etc., etc. That in itself is a kind of metaphorical way of thinking about it. And this articles, especially the second one that deals with virginity, which asks whether virginity is unlawful. And that's a very interesting question, by the way. That's a question which I've actually met people who've asked me that. Like, isn't virginity unlawful? Like, isn't remaining celibate like against God's commands? God said, it's not good for man to be alone. You should go forth, multiply, fill the earth, etc., etc. So that's definitely not a good thing. Remaining a virgin, remaining celibate, it has to be unlawful. That's actually a question which St. Thomas covers and answers in depth. But let's get into it. On virginity in 5 articles. The first article poses a question whether virginity consists in integrity of the flesh. So here is driving at giving us a definition of virginity. What does virginity actually mean within the context of Catholic theology? So rather than jumping into the objections immediately, I want to go into the I answer that section and then use that as a key to unlock both the objections and the reply to the objections, because I think in that way we shall understand much more. On the contrary, Augustine says that in his treatise on virgins, he says that virginity is continence, whereby integrity of the flesh is vowed, consecrated, and observed in honor of the Creator of both soul and flesh. Okay, so what is continence? What's integrity of the flesh? All of that is going to be expounded on just now in the I answer that section. I answer that. This is St. Thomas saying what his response is to that question, whether virginity consists in integrity of the flesh. Virginity takes its name apparently from viro, which must be a Latin word meaning freshness. And just as a thing is described as fresh and retaining its freshness, so long as it is not parched by excessive heat, so too virginity denotes that the person possessed thereof, the person who has virginity, is not burnt by the heat of concupiscence, which is experienced in achieving the greatest bodily pleasure, which is that of sexual intercourse. This concept is an important one to keep in mind because it's something which St. Thomas is going to come to again and again, especially quoting St. Augustine. And St. Augustine was someone who knew a lot about the pleasures of the flesh and sexual pleasures, etc. For more information, go and check out his autobiography called The Confessions of St. Augustine. And there's a sentence which St. Augustine keeps coming back to and which St. Thomas likes to bring up and to quote in different ways, which is that there is nothing which pushes the human mind further away from the contemplation of God than physical pleasure. And the thing which the greatest physical pleasure is precisely venereal or sexual pleasure. And therefore, it is sexual pleasure which has the greatest effect in terms of pulling the mind away from contemplating God. This is a concept which Augustine puts forward in his writings and which St. Thomas likes to come back to when he's speaking about the importance of the virtue of chastity. Moving on. Now, venereal pleasures offer 3 points for consideration. The first is on the part of the body, namely the violation of the seal of virginity. The second is the link between that which concerns the soul and that which concerns the body, and this is the emission of semen causing sensible pleasure. The third is entirely on the part of the soul, namely the purpose of attaining this pleasure. Of these 3 topics, these 3 considerations, the first is accidental to the moral act, which as such must be considered in reference to the soul. What does he mean by this? By this, he's saying that virginity, being a virtue, is something which is a moral act. Remember, we said that morality and moral life has to do with the life of the will. So virginity has to do primarily with what a person wants, what they desire, the inner choice that they make. Secondarily, circumstantially, accidentally, it has to do with what's happening in the body. So what's happening in the body is not essential. What's essential is the decision, the choice, the action that's happening in the soul. And then what happens in the body is merely an accident, merely a circumstance, merely a result of that. So that's what he means by that. The second topic, theme, that we must think about when considering virginity is it stands in relation of matter to the moral act, since the sensible passions are the matters of moral acts. What does he mean by this? Remember in the previous episode, we used an analogy of a carpenter making a chair. So if you want to apply that analogy here, you could say the subject of virginity is the person who makes the choice to practice this virtue of virginity. The matter of virginity is the wood that is used to make a piece of furniture, a chair, etc., etc. And then the form of virginity is that specific decision to retain one's physical, let's call it here, they call it integrity, but basically it means that idea of abstaining from sexual pleasure for the sake of contemplating divine goods. So that's you take that decision and you shape it in that way. You take that matter and you shape it in that way. That's what he means by the form, and we're going to get to that just now. The second stands in relation of matter to the moral act, since the sensible passions are the matters of moral acts. But the third stands in the position of form and complement, because the essence of morality is perfected in that which concerns the reason. Since then, virginity consists in freedom from the aforesaid corruption, that is the corruption of fleshly pleasures, and we shall understand why he called it corruption just now when we go into the objections and replies to the objections. Since then, virginity consists in freedom from the aforesaid corruption, it follows that the integrity of the bodily organ is accidental to virginity. In other words, what's technically happening with your body is not essential to virginity. What is essential is, while freedom from pleasure in the emission of the semen is related thereto materially, and the purpose of perpetually abstaining from this pleasure is the formal and completive element in virginity. In other words, what virginity consists of is the purpose, the intention, the choice, the willing to perpetually abstain from the pleasure of sex for the end, for the reason, for the goal of the contemplation of divine things. That's the essence of virginity. Everything else that can happen is accidental, which is why, so for instance, if let's say, God forbid, a nun is sexually assaulted, has she lost her virginity? Not from the point of virtue, she has not. She has not lost her virginity because it went against her will. What happened to her was against her will. Reply to objection 1. It would seem that virginity does not consist in integrity of the flesh, for Augustine says that virginity is the continual meditation on incorruption in a corruptible flesh. But meditation does not concern the flesh. Therefore, virginity is not situated in the flesh. In other words, this objection is saying, since virginity is about the soul, therefore its matter has nothing to do with the flesh. It's got nothing to do with the flesh. St. Thomas replies, this definition of Augustine expresses directly that which is formal in virginity, which we just spoke about now. The thing that gives virginity its shape, that makes it what it is, transforms the wood into a chair as opposed to a table, is the choice, the deliberate wanting to abstain perpetually from sexual pleasures for the sake of divine reasons. For meditation denotes reason's purpose, and the addition, perpetual, does not imply that a virgin must always retain this meditation actually, but that she should bear in mind the purpose of always persevering therein. The material element is expressed indirectly by the words on incorruption in a corruptible body. This is added to show the difficulty of virginity, for if the flesh were incorruptible, it would not be difficult to maintain a perpetual meditation on incorruption. The second objection, further virginity denotes a kind of purity. Now, Augustine says that purity dwells in the soul, therefore virginity is not incorruption of the flesh. Again, this harkens back to our previous episode where we spoke about purity being something that dwells in the soul. And so if purity dwells in the soul, virginity, and virginity has to do with purity, therefore, and virginity cannot be something to do with the flesh. And the reply to this is, it is true that purity, as to its essence, is in the soul, but as to its matter, it is in the body. And it is the same with virginity. Wherefore, Augustine says in his treatise on virginity that although virginity resides in the flesh, and for this reason is a bodily quality, yet it is a spiritual thing, which a holy continency fosters and preserves. I won't go into the third objection and the reply to that because I sort of touched on it when I gave the example of, say, a nun who is sexually violated. Does that mean she has lost her virginity? And the answer to that is no, because virginity predominantly is, in terms of its essence, is a choice in the mind and the heart and the will. It's secondarily, only in terms of its matter, only circumstantially has to do with the body and physical integrity. But let's jump to the fourth one, because the fourth one also sheds a little bit of light and is sounds a bit weird at first, but let's read it. Further, objection 4, further corruption of the flesh consists chiefly in the emission of the semen, and this may take place without copulation, whether one be asleep or awake. So back in the days of St. Thomas Aquinas, there was this idea that whenever a man emits semen for any reason whatsoever, there's a part of him which is deteriorated, which is degraded, which is worn out, which disintegrates. He loses part of his virility, of his lively, of his manhood, of his being a man. So this is one of the reasons why, for instance, if you read carefully like the Old Testament, you'll pick up that there are many instances where, for instance, if soldiers were going to war, like in the Book of Kings, this comes up a couple of times. If soldiers were going to war, they were always told, listen, you have to stay away from your wives, do not sleep with your wives, etc. And this was the idea behind it, that kind of reduces your strength as a man. In fact, I remember once, I think it was some AFCON or something, many years ago, where I was reading about the team that won the AFCON. I don't know if it was Cameroon or something. And one of the things the coach said was that all the players were told, like during the AFCON, you are not allowed to touch any woman. Do not touch women. And I think it harkens back to this idea. So I'm not trying to offend any women out there. I'm just saying, a concept that is behind, that informs this idea. And the objection runs, yet seemingly virginity is not lost without copulation, as Augustine says, that virginal integrity and holy continency that refrains from all sexual intercourse is a portion of angels. Therefore, virginity does not consist in incorruption of the flesh. In other words, what he's saying is, whenever a man has any emission of semen, he has lost their virginity, but that cannot be the case. Therefore, virginity does not consist in integrity of the flesh. To understand all these objections, always remember, we're trying to answer this question about integrity of the flesh. Does virginity consist in your flesh remaining in a certain specific way and never changing physically? What St. Thomas answers is, pleasure resulting from emission of semen may arise in two ways. If this be the result of the mind's purpose, if this becomes the result of free will, it destroys virginity, whether copulation takes place or not. Augustine, however, mentions copulation because such like resolution is the ordinary and natural result thereof. In another way, this may happen beside the purpose of the mind, either during sleep or through violence and without the mind's consent, although the flesh derives pleasure from it, or again through weakness of nature, as is in the case of those who are subject to a flow of semen. In such cases, virginity is not lost because such like pollution is not the result of impurity which excludes virginity. The impurity which excludes virginity is the willing, the free choice that is made to engage in these acts of sexual pleasure. The second article, whether virginity is unlawful. This one was the interesting one. Objection 1, it would seem that virginity is unlawful. Whatever is contrary to a precept of the natural law is unlawful. Now, just as the words of Genesis 2:16, of every tree that is in paradise thou shalt eat, indicate a precept of the natural law in reference to the preservation of the individual, so also the words of Genesis 1:28, increase and multiply and fill the earth, express a precept of the natural law. in reference to the preservation of the species. Therefore, just as it would be a sin to abstain from all food, as this would be to act counter to the good of the individual, so too it is a sin to abstain altogether from the act of procreation, for this is to act against the good of the species. Oh, that's a good objection. That's a very intelligent objection. Objection 2, further. Whatever declines from the mean of virtue is apparently sinful. In other words, we said virtue is the mean, right? Middle ground. So whatever falls away from that middle ground is sinful. Now, virginity falls away from the mean of virtue, since it abstains from all sexual pleasures. For the philosopher says in Ethics 2:2 that he who revels in every pleasure and abstains from not even one is intemperate, but he who refrains from all is loutish and insensible. Therefore, virginity is something sinful. And here it's important to remember that St. Thomas uses vice and sin interchangeably. So, if virginity, and basically saying, moving away from something that's the mean, the middle ground between two extremes, and you move to one extreme, that's always a vice and that's always a sin. So virginity is unlawful because all sins and all vices are unlawful. This is another very clever objection, and I love this objection because what it does is it helps us to understand better what this idea of the mean of virtue means. It's actually an image to describe something abstract. But the image, the analogy, that phrase, mean of virtue, is an analogy that does not perfectly capture the idea of what virtue is. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let's go to the third objection. Further, punishment is not due except for a vice. Now, in olden times, those were punished who led a celibate life, as Valerius Maximus asserts. Hence, according to Augustine, Plato is said to have sacrificed to nature in order that he might atone for his perpetual continency as though it were a sin. Therefore, virginity is a sin. In other words, Plato, that Greek philosopher who gave us all the writings and not writings, but, conversations, dialogues of Socrates, he decided to remain a virgin all his life. And to make up for that, he had to offer sacrifices to the gods because he knew he was committing a sin. So it's obvious virginity is a sin. On the contrary, no sin is a matter of direct counsel. Now, do you remember we spoke about the difference between precepts and counsels? We said precepts is like if you want to get to heaven, think of getting to heaven as getting a degree in your high school diploma, right? Now, the precepts are your obligatory subjects, your math, your first language, whatever. And then the counsels are your added on bonus extra subjects, which you can do if you're really talented or really smart or really gifted in a specific area, and they just give you like a leg up to get to an even better university and do the exact course you want to do, etc., etc. So using that's how to remember and understand this idea of counsels. No sin is a matter of direct counsel, as opposed to a direct precept. Basically saying no sin, there's no counsel and there's no precept that can ask someone to commit a sin. But virginity is a matter of direct counsel, for it is written in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 25, concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, but I give counsel. Therefore, virginity is not an unlawful thing. I answer that. This is St. Thomas giving his response. I answer that in human acts, those are sinful which are against right reason. Remember that important concept. In human acts, those are sinful which are against right reason. Now, right reason requires that things directed to an end should be used in a measure proportionate to that end. Again, is repeating that idea of what we spoke about under gluttony. What does right reason consist in? It consists in two things. Number one, choosing the correct end, and number two, using the right means to achieve that end. So right reason requires that things directed to an end should be used in a measure proportionate to that end. Again, man's good is threefold as stated in Ethics 1:8. One, consisting in external things, for instance, riches. Another, consisting in bodily goods, for instance, health. The third, consisting in the goods of the soul, among which the goods of the contemplative life take precedence of the goods of the active life, as the philosopher shows in Ethics 10:7, and as the Lord declared in Luke chapter 10 verse 42, when he told Martha that Mary has chosen the better part, that the better part, the best part, are the spiritual goods of the soul, which lead us to contemplate God, who is our ultimate end. Of these goods, Those that are external, such as riches, are directed to those which belong to the body, such as health. And those which belong to the body, such as health, are directed to those which belong to the soul, such as prayer or virtue. And furthermore, those which belong to the active life are directed to those which belong to the life of contemplation. So an example of active life is, let's say, teaching. Let's say there is a monk, an order of monks or nuns who dedicate themselves to teaching or who dedicate themselves to looking after the sick, etc. What they do has to be directed to an even higher goal. And the highest goal is a contemplation of God. So for them, the end of teaching, the end of looking after the sick is to contemplate God in prayer here on earth, or in the faces of the sick people who they look after, and hereafter in the beatific vision where they see God face to face. Accordingly, right reason dictates that one use external goods in a measure proportionate to the body. So, for instance, it doesn't make sense to accumulate more houses and cars and riches than you need to keep your body healthy. And in like manner, as regards the rest. Wherefore, if a man refrain from possessing certain things, which otherwise it were good for him to possess, for the sake of his body's good, or of the contemplation of truth, this is not sinful, but in accord with right reason. This is so important. Basically saying there's a hierarchy of goods. Everything is the lower goods are directed to the higher goods. Now, if someone he abstains from a lower good so that he can attain a higher good, in other words, that thing that lower good was directed towards. So for instance, if a person, let's say you need a certain amount of clothing so that your body can be healthy. You need your body to be healthy so that you can pray. But then one day you realize, hang on, this amount of clothing actually that I have, I've got 2 coats. Let me give one to this poor person on the street, and that will help me to think more of our blessed Lord Jesus Christ and his words and his example. So that's an example where a material good, which is something that's, like kind of like riches, clothing, is sacrificed, even though it sort of harms that intermediate thing, which is, the health of the body and the material good itself, the amount of clothes in your wardrobe, but it's for the sake of the highest good, which is contemplation of the divine. That's what this point means. Wherefore, if a man refrain from possessing certain things which otherwise it were good for him to possess, for the sake of his body's good, or of the contemplation of truth, or for the sake of contemplating truth, this is not sinful, but in accord with right reason. In like manner, if a man abstain from bodily pleasures, in order more freely to give himself to the contemplation of truth, this is in accord with the rectitude of reason. Now, holy virginity refrains from all venereal sexual pleasure in order more freely to have leisure for divine contemplation. For as the apostle says in 1 Corinthians 7:34, the unmarried woman and the virgin think of the things of the Lord, that she may be holy in both body and in spirit. But she that is married thinks of the things of the world, how to please her husband. Therefore, it follows that virginity, instead of being sinful, is worthy of praise. And this is what I was saying, is the true explanation, definition without analogies that helps us understand what the mean of virtue is. The mean of virtue is the direction of right reason towards a correct end, as well as shaping, proportioning the means at our disposal towards achieving that end. So basically, this is another definition of wisdom. Wisdom is ordering things towards their end correctly. And if the lower thing prevents you from achieving the higher thing, if you eschew the lower thing, let go of it, that does not in any way, so that you can achieve the higher thing, that is not sinful. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that is wisdom. So that's a much better way of understanding virtue, because that idea of saying virtue is the mean between 2 extremes, it helps one to remember it because it's kind of concrete. You can almost see it. You can picture a mirror or a line or some kind of scale or balance. That's great. But remember, it's an analogy, and there is no such thing as a perfect analogy except between God the Father and God the Son. Other than that, all analogies are imperfect. And this analogy of virtue being the mean between 2 extremes falls away when you consider something like virginity, which is a virtue because it directs us, even though it seems to decline, fall away from the mean, it directs us towards the end. And this is the essence of virtue, directing us according to right reason to choose the right ends and to choose the right means to achieve those ends. Reply to objection 1. The whole Genesis thing. Hey, in Genesis we were told, fill the earth and multiply. Reply to that objection is a precept implies a duty, as stated above. Now, there are two kinds of duty. There is a duty that has to be fulfilled by one person, and a duty of this kind cannot be set aside without sin. The other duty has to be fulfilled by the multitude, and the fulfillment of this kind of duty is not binding on each one of the multitude. For the multitude has many obligations which cannot be discharged by the individual, but are fulfilled by one person doing this and another doing that. So, in other words, what he's saying is, if a command is given which can only be done by one person, if that one person doesn't do it, then it's a sin. But if a command is given which has to be done by a group of people, then even if one person in that group doesn't do it, so that he can facilitate the other people in the group doing it, then that is not a sin. Because at the end of the day, the commands are all directed towards our contemplation of God. So if one person says, I will not multiply and fill the earth so that I can help others to contemplate God, which is the ultimate end, then in no ways is it a sin. I'm summarizing because I'm very painfully aware of the time. Reply to objection 2. Further, whatever declines from the mean of virtue is apparently sinful. Now, virginity declines from the mean of virtue. And this is what we have spoken about at length. But for more details, you can read the exact objection. And the third objection is the one about Plato offering sacrifices to make up for the fact that he was celibate. And the reply to this objection is, and what shed light for me was, laws are framed according to what occurs more frequently. Now, it seldom happened in olden times that anyone refrained from all sexual pleasure through love of the contemplation of truth, as Plato alone is related to have done. Hence, it was not through thinking this is a sin that he offered sacrifice, but because he yielded to the false opinion of his fellow countrymen. What this signaled for me was the fact that now we live in a time of grace, a period of grace, a period of the new covenant, a period of the New Testament, of the new union between God and man, where it's a period of outpouring of grace compared to the old days before our Lord Jesus Christ came and sent his Holy Spirit. You find that now you have many, many more people who are called to, who have received this grace of virginity and the celibate life for the sake of the kingdom of God than in the old days. That's why in the old days, for instance, you won't find any patriarch in the Old Testament who was celibate, unheard of, but they were not living in the period of the of the New Testament, of the New Covenant. They're living in the period of the Old Law, the Old Covenant, the Old Testament.